So today I'm here to talk to you about a theatre practitioner known as Bertolt Brecht and his influence in theatre and his pioneering techniques in epic theatre. So just to start us off, I've got a quote there on the slide that I'll just move out of the way of, and it's audiences hang up their brains with their hats in the cloakroom. So this is the kind of idea that Bertolt Brecht used throughout his theatre form and used to pioneer his techniques, which I'm going to get into now. But before I do that, I'm just going to talk a wee bit about Brecht and just kind of gloss over his life a wee bit. So Bertolt Brecht was a theatre practitioner, obviously, but he was also a poet, a playwright, and a theatre director. So he was born in Germany and was alive during the First and Second World War. So he lived in a time of a lot of political turmoil, so a lot of his theatre has quite a strong political, social activist voice behind it. And his influence was quite large, and he is one of the main practitioners of the 20th century, along with a guy called Stanislavski, who's the one who pioneered the realistic drama technique that's quite common. So to start us off, I'm going to talk a wee bit about his influences and where he got the idea for his theatre. So the first, you've got a big Russian guy on the left side. His name is Karl Marx. So he was one of the leading figures who helped create communism. So Bertolt Brecht was a bit of a supporter of communism. He quite liked the idea of everyone equal, so that came in through his plays as a part of his social activist theatre. As well as that, you've got, of course, the Nazi flag in the middle there, because he was in Germany at the times that the Nazis rose to power. And one of his very famous plays, called Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, is actually based on the rise of the Nazi Empire. As well as that, you've got abstract theatre and Chinese theatre, which is quite artistic theatre that he liked using because it was symbolic and it didn't necessarily, and not everything in it told a story, which was quite important to his theatre form. So anyway, so now I'm just going to quickly talk about his actual theatre form. So his theatre form is something called didactic. Now this means that it's all about teaching, and the plays aren't there to necessarily entertain you and get you emotionally involved, but to teach you something. So that was quite an important thing. Objective with emotional detachment. This means he wanted you to be thinking about what's happening on stage without connecting to the characters in an emotional way. So normally in some plays and movies you feel an emotional connection to the characters, like when Mufasa died in Lion King. Right? So you feel an emotional connection to these characters and invest yourself in the story because of this. However, he wanted his plays to be didactic and for you to view them in an objective way with emotional detachment, which means he didn't want you to have that emotional connection. He wanted you to be thinking. So that brings it back to that first quote at the beginning. The audience hangs up their brains with the coats in the cloakroom. He wants you to keep your brain on and keep it thinking right throughout his plays. Now to do this, he had no clear plot, storyline, or tidy endings. Now this might sound a bit boring and weird to watch, but the way he structured his plays were quite interesting. So he didn't have one narrative from start to beginning. He would often do small episodic plots. So for example, in Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, there's 24 mini subplays and none of them are actually related to each other. But all of them tell a small story of the Nazis rising to power. So it's the idea that you get to see all these snippets from across society that don't necessarily relate, but help to paint a bigger picture that you can take a learning from. And it's a presentation of life, not reality. So a lot of the characters are not actually people with names, but they're used to represent a group of people. So you might have one person who's representing all communists, or someone who's acting as all housewives. So they're not individual people with their own emotions, they're trying to play archetypes, which I'm going to get to in a few minutes. So actually I'll get onto that now. So now I'm just going to talk you through 5 of the major techniques that he used. So for this, we're going to start doing some acting exercises to help you get used to them. So we're going to start with archetype characters. So can I have one volunteer just quickly? Alright, so you're going to come here and I'm going to whisper you for something that I need you to act out, and you're going to walk across the stage and we're going to see if they can guess what you are. Don't worry, it's pretty simple. So how do you think you can do that? So just walk across the stage like you would if you were playing that character. Soldier, bang on. You guys sit down now. So an archetype character is, the focus was on a group of individuals rather than one. So you wouldn't have named him as a specific soldier that you knew, he was just playing a soldier. And he could do that quite easily just by the way he moved, which I'm going to get to in another technique called justice. But as well as that, don't need a volunteer yet. So it was all about archetypes and playing stereotypes, and actors were asked to show the character at an arm's length. So this is trying to keep that emotional detachment. So they're not really getting into the emotions of being a soldier, but rather they're just playing the role and going through the motions without showing emotion, if that makes sense. So yeah, so there's a couple examples from plays. So I'm going to use Fear and Misery of the Third Reich because it's quite a good play to use it for. And of course you've got soldiers in that. So you would have a soldier that could play that. But there was also, in one particular play called Pete Boggs' Soldiers, there's a character who plays an SS officer. So he walks around up the top and he's got to keep the idea and remind you that he's a soldier just by the way he walks, because he doesn't necessarily have very many lines. So he's playing an archetype of a character. Now to show archetypes, they're pretty plain costumes, and it's all about the way that you move and the way that you act, but with that emotional detachment. So I'm going to go into the second one, which is called Justice. So I went over this just before. So I'm going to need 4 volunteers for this one. 3 of you just have to lie down on the ground. It's quite easy. So who wants to be the 3 that are lying down on the ground? Rakai, if you want to come down, and Sean. And who wants to help me out? So this is another person playing a soldier who wants to help me out. Anyone? Sure. Right, so can I just get you 3 to just lie yourselves down there? So the 3 that I put up first, just lie down there. It doesn't really matter. So you're pretending like you're dead bodies, pretty much. So you mate, you are going to be playing a soldier for us. Now in this, I'm going to ask you to do a few things. So we're going to do this 3 different times. To start us off, I want you to just walk across these as if they were dead bodies. Right? So just show me how you would walk if they were dead bodies. Yeah. Cool. Alright. Now walking back the other way, imagine that they're your friends that had died. How would you walk differently? Yeah? Yeah? Give him a D-Day. Cool. And now I want you to imagine walking back over them as if they were the enemy. Yeah. Alright, so you guys can go back and sit down after you go. So, what he did there is actually a form of what we call gestus. Now, gestus is a gesture that carries a kind of, so what is the wording for it? It shows an attitude or relationship towards a character's or a political attitude. So in there, we had a soldier who was walking across bodies. When he didn't know who they were, he just walked around them and didn't really pay much attention to them. But then when they were his friends, he was stopping, he was checking to see if they were okay. He didn't need to say anything, but you knew that he cared about the people that were down there. And then when they were his enemies, he pretty much stood over them, stood on them. I mean, he would have actually stood on them if they weren't actually people there. But it's the whole idea that he didn't care about them. So through a movement, he could show his relationship to the characters on the floor and a political message behind his movement. So this was quite important in Brechtian theatre because quite a lot of the dialogue was not realistic, so the gestus often had a lot of importance because it would help tell the message of the play in a form that isn't words. So the next one is called spas. Now spas is something quite different. It's not quite as serious. This is where the jokes would come in Brechtian theatre. So spas is the idea of making an audience laugh, but then have them question why they laughed. So, for example, I want you to imagine that there's a play going on and it's addressing suicide. So it's quite a serious piece. So then I want you to imagine that someone just walks on stage and says, "Are you feeling low, depressed? Try the new End It All." So that wasn't funny, you guys were supposed to laugh then. Haha. Yeah, there we go. So it's the whole idea that it makes the audience, they're supposed to laugh, and then they kind of go, "Hey, wait, why did I laugh at that? That's serious, that's not something to joke about. I need to think about why he did that." So the whole idea of spas is to make them wonder why, and then keep that in their head throughout the play. Would have helped if you laughed. Yeah, so that's a kind of technique to do with absurdism. So that's the whole idea that it's absurd to laugh at something like depression and suicide. It's not something you would casually laugh about every day, but he wanted you to then laugh about something so absurd, so you're thinking about it. So now I'm going to go into this other technique. It's song. So during his plays, he would use a lot of different songs and dance, because when you're viewing reality, people don't naturally break out into song and dance. We don't live in a musical. So it's weird to see song and dance. So immediately when you see that, you immediately realize you're not watching reality, you're rather seeing a presentation of it. So hopefully, if this works, we should be able to get this song. Oh, let's try like this. So this is a song that was written. You're gonna have enable editing. So this was a song that was written by Brecht and a part of one of his musicals that he did write called The Threepenny Opera. If it's, might just check it up on Google. Do you mind if I just...
No, go for that.
Yeah, cool. So this is from The Threepenny Opera. So this was it's a musical he wrote about a murderer, pretty much. So this is quite a famous song called Mac the Knife. Some of you may have heard of it, and we'll try and find the right version. So I want you to focus on two things to do with the Threepenny Opera, and specifically this song, is listen to the words, but also listen to the kind of upbeat nature of it. So I'll just try and get the volume up all the way. Should have probably thought about this before. Yeah, so cool. So the whole idea is it's based about a murderer in London. So the murderer is called Mac. So this song is telling you about Mac the Knife. So we've got to start it a couple minutes in because we've got a few seconds of dialogue before.
Hang on, I'm just switching something.
Yeah. So just pay attention.
Threepenny Opera. Flash like diamonds, shine and sparkle in the night, but may keep where justice and he keeps it out of sight. All the sun going down back lies a carpet turning grey, with his back turned and his knife Mac quietly slinks away. In the city, London's bankers on the road, Mac the Knife steals all their money, sources off to place the code in the freezing, stinking river. Everybody's rocked and drowned. It's not my boy now. The killer come to town. In the blazing fire of stars, in the lake, Mac is watching from the
Don't take risks. Don't take risks.
Cool. You can just stop it there. So, a couple of things that you would have noticed about that particular song is the actual music behind it was quite upbeat. But did any of you hear some of the lyrics that were in it? Most of them were actually quite dark and quite, well, they were telling you about the murders that he was doing. For example, one of the lyrics he was saying was, on the sidewalk Sunday morning lies a body oozing life. Someone sneaking around the corner, is it Mac the Knife? So it's a whole idea of, he would put this upbeat music behind this very dark message, and it would make the audience go, that's not what's supposed to be happening on stage. Like, we saw people who were pulling red out of their costumes to show that they were bleeding, and that's not realistic. It's a whole idea that he was using all of his techniques in one there, and that was just a good example of song. But the whole idea was, it was absurd. Like, why would you sing about someone dying? Why would you pull out a red handkerchief to show that you were bleeding? But it also was suggestive of the fact that he was walking around with a knife after people were lying in front of him oozing blood. So you knew that he was the one that killed them. Obviously, he didn't lie. So we'll just cut back to the PowerPoint now. We've just got one more technique to cover. and that is stagecraft and technology. So this one's pretty straightforward. So in his plays he would use a lot of different technology, and the stage were often empty of props, and it was quite minimalistic for the most part. So you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner there's someone holding a placard. So what he would do in a lot of his plays is he'd use projection or placards as a form of technology. So for example, that placard says in German, "I cannot ride a bike." Pretty random thing to put on a placard, but it tells you something about the character or what's happening in the scene that you wouldn't already know. So for in Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, he would use projections, for example, to project where they are and when they are. Because that way you know kind of the social context of what was happening at the time without them having to go over it in the play. And then also another very important example of stage technology was the idea of lighting. So in Brechtian theatre, epic theatre, he'd use white lights. And white lights aren't designed to elicit emotions. They're the plain colour. They're the colour that doesn't represent anything. For example, red would be anger, green would be envy or jealousy. And it's the idea that white doesn't represent that, so you're not going to immediately think those emotions, even subconsciously. So now, just for the final thing, I'm just going to cover some of his wider influences. So like I said, he's been one of the most influential theatre practitioners in the last 2 centuries. So, of course, he's got lots of books written about him because his political theatre started a movement that's influenced social activist theatre throughout today. In the middle there you've got Miss Saigon. So that's a Broadway play actually, and it's got a lot of themes that came from Brechtian and epic theatre. For example, it uses projections to help tell the audience where they are. And also you've got a man down the end that you might recognise called Charlie Chaplin, and he's a famous comedian actor who wouldn't use sound in his things, and he would do a lot of absurd movement and actions to kind of help tell a story, and he got that from Brechtian theatre. So that concludes my thing on Brechtian theatre today. Cheers for your help with the little acting exercises. I hope you guys know about Brecht now.